When I walk into communities or regions, which I'm doing on a regular basis, this is often how the communities look to me, which is that you have these groups of committed people in a community. Consider each arrow represents a group of committed people. People such as yourselves. There'll be service clubs, there'll be economic development organisations, school boards, elected officials, etc., right? However, at the level of the community or the region, those groups look a little unfocused sometimes. But the question is, where's your community going? Yeah, so you get fractions, you get potential conflicts. So if this was in your country and this was a game of football, this would be like having 22 guys on the field, all playing their guts out, all giving it everything they've got, but they all just think the goalpost is a different direction. It'd be sort of fascinating for about 5 minutes, right? Now, in your communities, how many people, what percent of people in your communities do you think carry the burden of leadership? What percent? So 1, 5, something like that, right? Consider that in most communities, that's pretty much the case. There's a few people on the court playing the game, and the rest are sitting in the grandstand watching. Is that a compelling game to get involved in? And often we wonder, well, why don't people get involved? Well, that might go part of the way, at least, to explaining. Where you're going, right? Now, and almost all the work that I do is working with communities to answer that question for themselves. What is the vision that the community shares? What kind of community do people want it to become? What are those deep aspirations, those desires, those heartfelt what you want for your community? And by the way, it's the most remarkable experience when that starts to come to light and get articulated by people. Now, I am sure there's at least some people in this room going, you'll never make that bloody well happen. We're not going to get consensus amongst our mob, right? Well, here, I do this all the time. What's the answer to this question? But it's there. Why? Because people share a community. They're there for a reason, because they love it. So it's like we get this chance to scratch the surface away and get past all that cynicism and that built up kind of, resignation, and find out what actually people really love for their community. My experience is that mostly people in rural communities really want their community to be the best possible place it can be. I know you do, or else you wouldn't be here. You wouldn't be here unless you deeply and passionately cared about the very future of your community. And if you could, wouldn't you want that for your community? Now, most people in communities have the same aspiration, but they don't even know where to start. What can I do? What can little old me do? And in fact, often in our communities, we only have the access maybe to vote once every couple of years. That's about it. So it's about how do you design those occasions, those events, those opportunities for people to find a way to make a difference. And by the way, it can be fun. Sometimes you go to a conference like this and you think, oh my God, community development, economic development, what are we going to do, right? But I would suggest that if you're not having fun, you're probably doing the wrong work. Because once you articulate what is that shared vision for the future, it reaches back and changes the community. Why? Because it now makes sense for groups to collaborate together. And by the way, there's not a community in here, I would suggest, that's big enough or has enough spare resources that you can waste $1 or you can waste an hour of a volunteer's time. You have to find the way to make sure that every piece of effort, every little piece of resource is moving you towards a bigger picture. Because you have some real challenges. We heard some of those laid out today. But you, like everyone else, you just have your version of them. I want to talk a little about something that I think is really, really important as you engage in the work of thinking about how do you reinvent your community. And it's what I call the difference between context and content. So, consider in life and in our communities, there are two realms of play. There's what I call the contextual realm, and then there's the content realm. So let me deal with the content first of all, right? Farm boy, rural people. We know about content. That's like, what's the problem? Let's fix it. What needs to happen? Let's start the project. What have we got to build? Let's get on with it. We're really good at that. Why? Because it's just fundamental to our whole makeup. That's the content stuff. Now, this contextual stuff is a little harder to get your brains around, your hearts around. What I mean by context? Well, that's the environment that we're operating in. The type of thing that's in the context, consider that's like the culture. That's people's attitude. That's the vision or the absence of a vision. There's this contextual environment and the things that make that up, and then there's the content. Those two realms are incredibly powerfully related. Let me demonstrate, right? Imagine for a moment we're in a nightclub. Silver ball spinning, people are dancing. See, I'm old. Silver ball spinning, right? People are dancing, music's playing, everyone's having a really good time, right? I'm a total stranger and I walk up to this woman and I say, hello, excuse me, would you like to dance with me? Well, who knows? She'd say yes or no, right? But it would occur like an appropriate invitation in that environment. Now, change the scene. Middle of the day, broad sunshine, downtown Prince George, outside the post office, total stranger, walks up, hello, excuse me, would you like to dance with me? 911. I bet, right? But notice my action was no different. See, notice my action was, excuse me, would you like to dance with me? So consider that in life, the outcomes of our actions often has a lot more to do with the environment in which the action occurs than the action itself. And that is the relationship of context to content. One of the things you have to take account of as community leaders is what is that contextual environment? And what contextual environment do we need to create in our communities in order to have those things that we want to have happen show up? Right? I do a lot of work on is what is the prevailing contextual attitude of people in rural communities? And it's really about answering the question, how well are we equipped to respond to change? So this is from a data set that's from communities in no Canadian communities, right? But it's all American, North American, and typically Pacific Northwest, Midwest, that strip, and Australian rural communities, right? There's probably about 10,000 people in here, right? Maybe a whole raft of communities, probably 15 different states. It's just this lump of stuff, right? And what I keep asking people in these community visioning sessions, I ask them about, against these top 10 attributes of successful communities, which has been developed in research that's been done. So we have this top 10 attributes which you would expect to find in communities that are being successful. So I'm going to ask you to, as I go through this, you want to think about your own community, right? So there are these attributes. Let's go through and let's pick a few of these out. So evidence of strong community pride and inclusive culture. 72% of people in this enormous kind of homogenous mass say that their community is strong, right? So you could pretty much start to assume this is starting to point to some of the contextual environment of rural communities, at least in North America, or at least in America and Australia. I know you guys are different, right? But you may want to think about how would you answer this question if you were voting. Invest in the future, built to last, pretty close to split. Participatory approach to community decision making. 87% of people say that their community is weak. Creatively building new economic opportunities. 78% of people say their community is weak. Support local businesses. 75% of communities say that, or people say that their community is weak. Deliberate transition of power to new leaders. 90% of people say that their community is weak at that. Strong belief in support for education. Strong presence in traditional institutions. Way up there in the 80s and 90s, right? So if you took that that's the kind of, let's just think this is some sort of community in North Dakota somewhere, right? Or in the Pacific Northwest. How well would you say they're equipped to deal with the future? And why do you say not very? Well, here's what I see, right? And I think there's this inherent tension in this, right? And I suspect, I could be wrong, but I suspect it would probably play out something similar in Upper BC. So the inherent tension is the things that are about the future, invest in the future, build to last. Well, at best it's split. Participatory approach to community decision making. That's where people want to have a say in the future of their community. Weak. Creatively building new economic opportunities. Weak. Deliberate transition of power to new leaders. Weak. So there's this tension between the attributes that are, you may say, reflect traditional values, community pride, belief in education, traditional institutions, those attributes, and those attributes that are about the future. And that's part of the contextual shift that somehow or other you have to wrench in your community. Because I would suggest you consider that inside of that environment, very little different can show up. Very little different is possible. Why? Because that environment has got a lid on the whole deal. That's why the bright young people get up and go somewhere else. Now, what I think we're starting to understand is how do you rapidly and dramatically alter that? You know, we often think, and if I asked the question and said, how long do you think it would take to change the culture in your community? How long do you think it would take to change? If you consider that reflects the culture, right? How long do you think it would take to change the culture in your community? Generation, long time. Or consider it can actually occur much faster than that. But the key to that is you've got to understand where the culture of a community is created, manifested and perpetuated. See, where is the culture of your community, the prevailing culture? Where does that get created, manifested and perpetuated? So you want to think about this in a physical reality, in the physical universe. Consider the prevailing culture gets created, manifested and perpetuated in the conversation that prevails in the community. Consider the prevailing conversation both reflects, emanates, manifests, perpetuates the prevailing culture. Here's how you find out what the prevailing culture is. You go and sit in the pub for a bit. Or you go and sit in the coffee shop because you'll hear it real fast. Now, by the way, there's a very powerful connection between this and economic development. We discovered this in Western Australia a few years ago. We had a guy who was about to build the largest, most modern abattoir slaughterhouse in Australia. Self-made millionaire. Going to create 800 jobs, $80 million investment. He picked Western Australia. Woohoo! But then how he chose the location in Western Australia was fascinating. I thought he would do the number crunching, input costs, transport costs, livestock availability, outcome would come the answer. Well, he did the number crunching, came up with a range of options. Here's what he did. He drove around those communities and he sat in the pub. Had a couple of beers. And I said, what the hell are you doing? Do you just like beer a lot? He said, I'm about to employ 800 people. Wherever I go, that's going to be the majority of the available workforce. And I want to have 800 people who are going to be positive and going to be partners in my business. I don't want to employ 800 whining, complaining, dependent people. And that's the connection right there between community and economic development in today's world. Now, the nice thing about knowing that the prevailing culture of a community is manifested, perpetuated in what we say, is that's the one thing, it's probably the only thing we actually have a say about, what comes out of our mouth. The powerful thing about the community visioning processes and these conversations, if you can imagine what it'd be like if you had 20% of your community come together and create a powerful vision for the future. Do you reckon that'd change the prevailing conversation in town? Yeah. It can make a huge impact just overnight. And once you've created that, then something can start to move.